From the opening lines of Scripture, the Sabbath stands not as a burden, not as a legal requirement, not as a commandment waiting to be fulfilled, but as the first revelation of God's heart. Before sin, before sacrifice, before covenantal laws, before Israel, before priesthood, before prophets, before commandments carved in stone, there was Sabbath, God's own declaration of completion, identity, and delight. Genesis 2 verses 2-3 reveals the Sabbath as the divine seal upon creation, the moment when God stopped creating because humanity, his image bearer, had been formed. The Sabbath is eternal because it is rooted not in human failure, but in God's finished work. It is spiritual because it was given before flesh became corrupt. It is divine because it flows from God's own rest. And it is unforgettable because it is the first thing God blessed, sanctified, and named. The Sabbath is eternal because it is tied to humanity's identity as rulers over creation. God did not rest because he was tired. He rested because his image, humanity, had been installed as the rightful authority over the earth. Sabbath is the coronation of humanity. It is the divine proclamation that creation is complete because the one who bears God's likeness now stands as steward, governor, and representative. Sabbath is not about inactivity. It is about identity. It is the weekly reminder that humanity was created not to strive for worth, but to receive worth from the God who made them. In Sabbath, humanity remembers who they are because they remember who God is. The Sabbath is also a covering, a redemptive sign woven into the fabric of creation long before redemption was needed. When God later commanded Israel to redeem slaves, strangers, and even animals through Sabbath observance, he was not inventing something new. He was restoring what was lost. Sabbath is the rhythm of divine compassion. It is the weekly proclamation that no creature belongs to Pharaoh, no human belongs to oppression, and no life belongs to endless labor. Sabbath is the divine protest against exploitation. It is the spiritual covering that reminds humanity that God redeems, restores, and releases. Sabbath is not a commandment to obey. It is a liberation to receive. The Sabbath is the mark of the spiritual kingdom, not the earthly one. Earthly kingdoms are built on production, power, and performance. God's kingdom is built on rest, trust, and identity. Sabbath is the sign that God's kingdom is not of this world. It is the mark placed upon the heart, not the badge worn on the sleeve. It is the sign that God reigns not through force, but through love, not through domination, but through delight. Sabbath is the weekly reminder that the true kingdom is spiritual, eternal, and rooted in God's character. It is the mark that distinguishes those who live by divine identity rather than human striving. The Sabbath is the identity of God and man. God reveals himself as creator and redeemer through Sabbath. Humanity reveals itself as image bearer and beloved through Sabbath. No other commandment carries this mutual identity. The Sabbath is the meeting place where God's nature and humanity's purpose align. It is the covenantal handshake between heaven and earth. It is the weekly reminder that humanity is not defined by sin, failure, or flesh, but by the God who formed them, blessed them, and rested over them. Sabbath is the identity of God because it reveals his character. Sabbath is the identity of humanity because it reveals their origin. The Sabbath is the authority of God to be crucified for his people. Only the God who rested after creation could rest in the tomb after redemption. The Sabbath is the divine timetable that reveals the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Jesus died on Friday, rested on Sabbath, and rose on Sunday, not because of human tradition, but because Sabbath is the day that testifies that God alone saves. Sabbath is the authority of God to lay down his life. It is the divine proclamation that salvation is not earned by human effort, but given by divine sacrifice. Sabbath is the weekly reminder that redemption is God's work, not ours. The Sabbath is the reminder of the cross on earth. Just as God rested after creation, Christ rested after redemption. The Sabbath is the hinge between Eden and Calvary. It is the echo of "it is finished" spoken in creation and repeated at the cross. Sabbath is the day when heaven and earth remember that God alone completes what he begins. It is the day when humanity remembers that salvation is not achieved by doing but by trusting. Sabbath is the cross in weekly form, the proclamation that grace is sufficient, that God has acted, and that humanity is invited to rest in his completed work. The Sabbath is the set-apart, blessed day where the true God, in infinite love, chose to die to restore humanity to Edenic wholeness. Sabbath is not about inactivity, it is about divine initiative. It is the day when God reveals his heart most clearly, a heart willing to descend, to suffer, to redeem, and to recreate. Sabbath is the weekly reminder that God is not distant but present, not indifferent but invested, not passive but passionately committed to restoring humanity to the image he declared, very good. Sabbath is the day when divine love becomes visible. The Sabbath teaches humanity to rely on God, not on themselves. It is the only commandment that commands, not doing. Every other commandment exposes the indignity of flesh, murder, adultery, theft, coveting, idolatry, all reveal the brokenness of humanity. But Sabbath reveals the beauty of humanity. It is the weekly reminder that humanity is not defined by sin, but by God's image. Sabbath is the invitation to stop striving, stop proving, stop performing, and simply rest in the identity God has given. It is the divine rhythm that teaches humanity to depend on one another, to care for one another, and to trust in God's provision. Saturday is the only day God named. He did not name Sunday, Monday, or any other day. He named only one, Shabbat. This divine naming reveals its eternal significance. Sabbath is the seal of creation because God stopped creating after humanity. There is no further creation. Therefore, Sabbath is the sign that humanity is complete in God's design. And just as humanity was created on the sixth day, humanity will be recreated in Jesus, the Word made flesh. Sabbath is the weekly reminder that the same God who formed humanity from dust will restore humanity from brokenness. The Sabbath is the everlasting sign on the forehead and hand, not as a legal mark, but as a spiritual identity. The forehead represents the mind, the hand represents action. Sabbath shapes both. It forms the imagination, purifies intention, and aligns desire with divine goodness. Genesis 2 verses 2-3 records no evening or morning for the Sabbath because its blessing is unending. Sabbath is the eternal reminder of who God is and who humanity is meant to be. It is the day without boundaries, the day without darkness, the day that symbolizes the eternal rest of God's kingdom. Sunday, according to Jesus, is the first day, not the day of creation's completion, not the day of divine rest, not the day of covenantal identity. Sunday has value as the day of resurrection, but it does not carry the spiritual identity, blessing, separation, or divine naming of Sabbath. It is not the day God sanctified. It is not the day God blessed. It is not the day God rested. Sabbath alone carries the eternal, spiritual, divine identity of God and humanity. Sabbath is not a commandment to fulfill. It is a heartwork to receive. It is the eternal rhythm of divine love, the weekly reminder that God is creator, redeemer, and restorer, and that humanity is his beloved image, invited to rest in his finished work forever. The contrast between Sabbath and Sunday becomes even clearer when we examine the historical and spiritual roots of Sunday observance. While the Sabbath was spoken by God in a sinless world, blessed in Eden, and sanctified before the fall, Sunday emerged in human history through associations with sun worship, imperial power, and cultural assimilation. The very name Sunday reflects its origin, the day of the sun. Ancient civilizations from Babylon to Rome dedicated the first day of the week to the sun god, believing the rising sun symbolized power, victory, and human achievement. This stands in stark contrast to the Sabbath, which symbolizes divine completion, divine humility, and divine rest. Sabbath points upward to the Creator. Sunday historically pointed outward to creation. Sabbath is divine identity. Sunday, in its ancient roots, was human idolatry. This does not condemn individuals who worship on Sunday, but it does reveal that Sunday itself was never set apart by God as holy, sanctified, or covenantal. The Sabbath, by contrast, was mentioned in the sinless world before Adam and Eve fell. It is the only day in Genesis that God blessed and sanctified. It is the only day God named. It is the only day that carries divine identity. Sunday appears nowhere in the creation narrative, nowhere in the Edenic world, and nowhere as a sanctified day in Scripture. This is why Sabbath is eternal and Sunday is temporal. Sabbath is divine, Sunday is cultural. Sabbath is spiritual, Sunday is historical. Sabbath is God's identity, Sunday is humanity's invention. When humanity replaces the day God sanctified with a day rooted in human tradition, the shift is not merely calendrical, it is spiritual. It moves the heart from divine identity to human identity, from God's seal to human preference. This is why Scripture repeatedly warns against idolatry, not merely the worship of statues, but the worship of human ideas, human traditions, and human authority in place of God's revealed will. When a day rooted in sun worship becomes elevated above the day God blessed, the danger is not in the people but in the principle. Any day of worship that replaces the Sabbath becomes, by definition, a human substitute for a divine identity. And any substitute for divine identity becomes a form of idolatry, not because people intend evil, but because the act itself replaces God's sanctified time with human preference. Sabbath is the sign of God's kingdom. Sunday, historically, became the sign of human kingdoms. This is why Scripture describes the Sabbath as the sign on the forehead and hand. The forehead represents the mind identity, belief, intention. The hand represents action, behavior, practice, lifestyle. Sabbath shapes both. It forms the imagination toward God's goodness and aligns the actions toward God's rest. When humanity embraces Sabbath, they embrace God's identity. When humanity replaces Sabbath, they risk embracing a human identity detached from divine origin. This is why the Sabbath is called a seal, because it marks the soul with God's character. And this is why replacing Sabbath with another day can become spiritually dangerous. It shifts identity from God's seal to human invention. Every good work humanity does must be done under the identity of God, not under the identity of flesh. Sabbath is the weekly reminder that humanity is God's image bearer, not self-made. Sabbath is the weekly proclamation that all good works flow from God's goodness, not human effort. Sabbath is the weekly declaration that humanity is redeemed, covered, and restored by God's grace. When good works are done under the identity of Sabbath, they become acts of divine partnership. When good works are done under the identity of human tradition, they risk becoming acts of self-exaltation. Sabbath aligns the heart with God. Sunday, when elevated above Sabbath, aligns the heart with human tradition. This is why, for someone who has come to understand the Sabbath as God's eternal identity, choosing Sunday as a replacement may become a sign of rebellion, not rebellion in the sense of hatred or malice, but rebellion in the sense of choosing human authority over divine revelation. It becomes a rejection of the identity God gave humanity in Eden. It becomes a detachment from the divine seal. It becomes a step away from the spiritual kingdom and toward the kingdom of self. And the kingdom of self cannot sustain life. Without our identity attached to God, we cannot live. Without the seal of God, we cannot flourish. Without the Sabbath, we lose the rhythm that restores the soul. But when our identity is attached to God through Sabbath, we glow. Moses glowed when he spent time in God's presence. His face shone with divine glory because he rested in God's identity. Sabbath is the weekly opportunity to glow. It is the weekly invitation to be transformed. It is the weekly reminder that humanity is not defined by sin, but by God's image. Sabbath is the day when humanity becomes radiant with divine presence. Sabbath is the day when the soul is restored, the mind is renewed, and the heart is aligned with heaven. This is why Sabbath is eternal. This is why Sabbath is spiritual. This is why Sabbath is divine. This is why Sabbath is unforgettable. It is not a commandment to obey. It is an identity to receive. It is not a burden. It is a blessing. It is not a law. It is a love gift. It is not about doing. It is about being. It is not about performance. It is about presence. Sabbath is the weekly reminder that God is creator, redeemer, and restorer, and that humanity is his beloved image, sealed with his identity, resting in his finished work.